The new 14.9 patch has so much new content at TFT that Mortdog was calling it set 11.25, with dozens of new items, system changes to player damage and shop odds, as well as a usual array of buffs and nerfs. It can definitely feel like we forgot entirely how to play TFT. Let's go ahead and dive into how to approach this patch and then use the TFT Academy tier list to explain what compositions are performing the best. Before we go into the tier list, let's talk about our game plan of how to approach the patch. The first thing is that there are no direct nerfs to forecast except for Kayn. So while Kayn is a little bit weaker, in general, I still expect it to be very much a forecast meta. Reroll is more viable this patch because they did buff certain things, but in general, it's more consistent than put on forecast because you only need to find 3 copies of a forecast versus the 9 copies of a specific reroll unit, and that's going to be a lot harder to hit. So I would suggest around 70 to 80% of your games currently to plan around playing around a forecast, and then 20 to 30% of the time you're looking to reroll if you have a really good start for it. Second thing is that stage 4 damage is a lot higher now. They added damage from stage 4, 5, 6 onwards. And so late game, you're going to get punished a lot harder, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Forecast odds are now lower at levels 8 and 9. For example, they've reduced the odds of forecast to 20 and 30%. And then instead, they put some of those percents into 2 costs and 1 cost at 9, which actually ends up being kind of nice if you are playing a vertical comp, for example, that needs a specific 1 cost. Let's say you are playing around Fated and you are level 9. This gives you a higher chance of hitting things like Ahri and Yasuo too. There's a lot of 3 cost buffs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Syndra got a huge nerf in the B patch. New artifacts enable specific comps, meaning that on the tier list as we go over it, there's going to be specific artifacts that these comps will be elevated by. One example would be putting Forbidden Idol on Tahm Kench and then re-rolling him alongside Bard. We'll talk about more of that in a little bit. And then Ghostly and Heavenly are more selfish and less support oriented, because now Ghostly only works for Ghostly units and Heavenly gives double the bonus but no longer gives star level bonus. What this means is that being strong on stage 4 onwards is critical. If you miss a turn on a transition, if you are trying to spike at the later half of stage 4, like after the carousel on 4-5, you're going to take immense amount of damage and be surprised about how fast you're losing your HP. Because they didn't increase the damage on stage 2 and 3, though, you can still kind of play lose streak. So don't be that afraid of losing HP early. It's more about stage 4. Hitting specific forecast 2-star is less consistent because you're going to be having lower odds. So that means you're going to need more gold. That does mean you have to be a little bit more open-minded and play more flexibly than maybe you want to. As a sub tip, avoid forcing lines just because of one item. So for example, if you have Last Whisper, that doesn't mean you have to play Ashe because you put it on a sniper. You can put it on Kai'Sa, for example. You can also put it on some of your melee carries if you're still playing like Heavenly, Kayn, and Lee Sin. So just be more open-minded on what you're rolling, because a lot of times if you roll and say, hey, I'm playing Ashe because I have a Last Whisper and like 1 bow, that means that you're very likely to miss and as a result go bot 4. Take econ augments more often in the early game because you're going to need more gold to hit your forecast. It's also nice too because if you can clear the level 8, you can get to level 9 a lot easier now because level 9 is cheaper even though level 8 is more expensive. Unless high rolling, you're often going to stay on level 8 and roll to 0. People call this donkey rolling in TFT. And so don't feel like you can just go to 9 because you hit a couple of upgrades. You might have to roll and be strong consistently from stage 4 and 5. And then towards the end of stage 5, make a push to level 9. But if you are high rolling, you have a lot of HP, you have a lot of econ augments, maybe you have Exalted in, you definitely can find a way to push to 9 if you're pretty stable. Be willing to play around upgrade 3 cost more. Now that they buff things like Alune and Zoe and they are much more reliable, you can play around 3 cost if you're missing your 4 cost. Lissandra is no longer an auto-occlude, which is really important to know. She is nice for the utility, but at this point, Lissandra is much more for specific counters to matchups. She's no longer, you see her in shop, you buy her, you play her because Lissandra is OP. Last, Heavenly and Ghostly emblems should be on the carries and not the support units. In the past, if you played like a vertical Heavenly comp, you put the Heavenly emblem on like a Morgana in the back because it just gave your whole team Omnivamp. Now the holder of it gets double the amount, so you want to put things like Heavenly on Kayn as opposed to before. And that same thing applies to Ghostly as well. You want Ghostly on the carry, so it gives them a bunch of damage amplification. And the last slide I want to talk about are the best openers to play around, because in the ideal world, you're not rolling your gold until you get to level 8, but sometimes you have to. If you play a stronger opener that has more versatility to it, it's less likely that you have to roll and therefore preserve as much gold as possible to get to 8 and roll your gold for 4 costs. The best opener, in my opinion, still is Storyweaver if you can get the good upgraded versions of all the units, because it's just versatile with holding both AD and AP items. Sivir holds all the AD, like Last Whisper, Rageblade, Rudens, whatever you want. And then if AP item holders, there are 2 really good ones. You can put it on Teemo or Zyra. Both hold the AP items really, really well. So they end up being really good carries, especially if you can upgrade them. Duelist Heavenly is really good for melee carries. Melee being things like Bloodthirster, Hand of Justice, Titan's Resolve, Crown Guard. If you get the AP items, put them on Darius. If you get 80 items, put it on Qiyana. Qiyana 2 is a lot better now because of the changes to Heavenly. Now Qiyana gets more benefit from Heavenly bonus herself. And then Faded is the absolute ruler of early game AP. If you're able to get items onto Ahri/Kindred and then get like an early Thresh, Sunfire on Thresh, or just any kind of defensive items, it becomes really difficult to deal with. And 5 Faded is still extremely powerful in stage 3, arguably the best stage 3 opener you can have. So always look to pick up Faded units if you can because of how powerful they can snowball the early mid game. The good openers are stuff like Fortune, which is still pretty self-explanatory. You just lose streak, you play Fortune. The most common lines you end up playing from Fortune are AD carries like Kai'Sa and Ashe. And that's because those comps are pretty expensive. They have several 4 costs you want to play. Ashe wants Annie and Lillia and Nautilus. Kai'Sa wants Galio and Sylas, so you just need a lot of resources. And Kog'Maw is really good if you have like AP and blue buff and you want to put, you know, things onto Kog'Maw, ladder into Syndra, or just generally play like an AP opener. But the thing about Kog'Maw is you kind of need like upgrades for him because even though he did get buffed this patch, if you have 1-star Kog'Maw, 1-star Cho, it doesn't really do much. So it gets kind of rolled over by the best openers. And the situational ones are things that can be good, but it depends a lot on how your game is forming. So stuff like a good Inkshadow tattoo, such as Tattoo of Toxin early, can be really good. And also, you want to make sure that you hit things like Senna 2 pretty early because you just lag damage otherwise. And then if you have like verticals, because you have a hero augment, you get like a specific emblem, like a Dryad opener, you could play 4 Dryads early. Those can be really good, but you just can't really get that consistently every game. All right, let's jump into the tier list for patch 14.9b from TFT Academy. It's a new website started by myself and Dish Soap to give you up-to-date information every single day. We update it all the time for a tier list that's relevant. We also started a new podcast, TFT Study Hall, that is audio only. It's also on Spotify. So if you're playing TFT and just want to listen to something in the background, you can check it out. Every single episode, we cover things like the meta and a couple of fundamental skills. Like, for example, our first episode was how to choose augments, and Dish Soap and my philosophy on how we approach that subject. Starting at the top of S tier, we have Ashe as the Invoker Flex variant. This is a version that got really popular because it's playing around some of the best forecasts like Annie and Nautilus, which are just really good frontliners. And Porcelain is what really helps take this over the top if you can get a Porcelain emblem onto Annie. Very, very good for damage reduction, and Annie sustains itself really well. Also, a really good holder of Porcelain emblem is Lillia. Lillia can be very, very strong. So definitely make sure to get 2 Porcelain emblems if you can. Get the 6 Porcelain, put on Annie and Lillia, and you often just win the game. Ashe's best in slot items are still the same, which is Rageblade and Last Whisper plus 1 extra item. A lot of times you can go for just raw AD like Deathblade, but a lot of things can work here. Ruden's Hurricane ends up being really good because of the amount of times Ashe attacks. Gunblade is really good to sustain your front line. And so if you have like a floating sword, you actually have a couple of different options that you can always play. Lissandra is weaker this patch, but she's still a really good utility unit, especially if you get her on level 8 early to disable certain front lines and melee carries. And the other thing to think about is that positioning really does matter a lot in these matchups. Lillia, for example, can be anywhere from D2 to D6. Try and avoid putting her in the corners because of the angle which she shoots her orbs. And Azir generally wants to be in the center. Ashe in the corners. The best opener for this is the Storyweaver because you have 80 options on Sivir, AP items on Teemo, and then all these units can be sold except for Amumu. One thing I do want to say is a lot of people feel like when you play around Ashe with Invokers that if you don't have Ashe items, you can't play this comp. The reality is sometimes you can actually carry Lillia for quite some time and have Ashe catch up later in the game. Let's say you start off with like blue buff Morello on Teemo, you hit Lillia 2 really easily, you have only 1 item Ashe 1, that's okay. You can actually still find a way for Lillia, Annie 2, and you know, like some of these other support units to help you carry in the mid game. And that's what kind of makes this composition like medium and not easy, because even though you still play like the same core units every single time, there's a lot of different ways you can actually approach it. You don't have to always have Ashe be the hyper carry. You can have kind of a sum of its parts through like Lillia 2. Maybe you end up finding like a Alune 2 instead of a Zyra because it's kind of hard to hit a Zyra on 8. And then you play like a 4 Invoker setup on level 8 with, you know, Ashe as a support DPS. We wrote like a ton of text on some of the stage tips, so it can be pretty overwhelming in terms of like reading all this while you're playing the game. It is one of the harder lines to pull off, but I believe it has really high ceiling. If you don't have a Porcelain emblem, you end up capping a lot lower, and you know, other comps like Kai'Sa or Syndra will probably beat you. But that's going to be pretty, you know, symptomatic of a balanced meta, because just because you hit the core units of what you are looking for, if you don't have something that like particularly takes your comp over the top, like if you don't have a Porcelain emblem, or you don't have like really good combat augments, or you got there really fast and you're able to push level 9, you're just not going to have like a significant edge. So don't expect that just because this is the top of S tier and you hit all this board, if you hit too late, other people have like the +1s or like some crazy artifacts that take their power to the next level. You're still probably gonna just play for like a top 4 while other comps end up winning out. Another thing to keep in mind is Lissandra positioning is really crucial in the late stage of the game. Lissandra landing onto the right unit like a melee carry such as Lee Sin or Kayn, or disabling their frontline tank like an enemy Annie, can be the difference between winning and losing the fight. So just make sure that you're trying to juggle all this positioning. It can be really tough. I just gave you like 4 or 5 different units you have to reposition for specific fights. That's partially what makes this comp kind of tricky. In second place in S tier right now, we have Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa is the other AD carry that you want to play around. Kai'Sa is mainly driven right now around Fortune or really high tempo openers like Storyweaver Teemo. Get like an early Teemo 2 with Morello and Shojin. Shojin eventually goes on Kai'Sa or Xayah, things like that, and you're just win streaking. But the reason why you really want to play around Fortune into this is because just look at how many 5 and 4 cost you really want. It's going to be really expensive, and you want items on all of them. I mean, it's pretty optimal to also get 3 good items on Sylas, not just Thieves Gloves, but he can be a good Thieves Gloves holder, which is why we have it labeled this way. Another variation you can play with early game comp, because, you know, it might be confusing to see Storyweaver Teemo plus this Inkshadow, is that Inkshadow can still ladder really nicely into it, but it's a little bit more on the high roll side, like we talked about. Kind of have good Inkshadow tattoos. Once you cash out with Fortune or you're done win streaking in stage 4, get to level 8, roll for Kai'Sa 2, Galio 2, but you oftentimes end up maybe hitting Kai'Sa 1, maybe a Xayah 1, and then just playing 4 Trickshot that way with Kai'Sa 1, Xayah 1, and pushing to 9. Inkshadow can be really clutch as well, so sometimes you're not going to be able to get 4 bruisers. Maybe you play like 3 bruisers because you don't hit Sylas and you hit like a random Udyr, so you play Aatrox Udyr, 3 bruisers, 4 trick shots, and then try to push 9 that way. So the entire nuance of this composition is learning when you can push to level 9 so you don't have to stay on 8 and rolling to 0. But a lot of times you are going to roll to 0 because you're low HP. You want to make sure that you're stabilizing before you go to level 9 and add those 5 costs. A little bit of a mistake here on our end. Trash Treasure is still on this tier list. This is disabled, but that still doesn't discount the fact that artifacts are still just good in this comp. Mana Zane is very good on Kai'Sa, as well as like a bunch of the other AD stuff. Gold Collector, Sniper's Focus, etc. Sylas and Udyr are really good around some of the new artifacts like Suspicious Trenchcoat. You can always put Eternal Winter or defensive stuff on Galio. So artifacts are just generally very good in this composition. If you open up an artifact animal, for example, really good composition to think about because you can pretty much use any combination of those artifacts through this comp because of a mixture of AD and AP and defensive units. In third, we have Porcelain Flex, which is basically the Ashe variant that plays for a higher ceiling and leans a little bit more into the AP elements playing around Syndra. Compare this to Invoker Ashe Flex. A lot of times Lillia is a secondary thought, but in this variant, you're pretty much leaning on Ashe and Syndra to deal a ton of damage and then anchoring around Set and Lissandra. It caps higher, in my opinion, than the Invoker line, meaning that it is more likely to win games, but it's just harder to hit because Set is going to be difficult to hit. And a lot of times your mid game can be a little bit awkward, especially if you're stuck on 1-stars. But the reason why we put this is because this is another variation of Ashe that you should ultimately be thinking about always. And also, it gives you a little bit more versatility of options of who to put the Porcelain Emblem on. Syndra is much more contested this patch, though, and we're going to talk a little bit of reason why. So it is going to be hard to hit. But ultimately, I do believe this is the highest cap Ashe variant, and so powerful enough that we think it deserves its own slot on the tier list, similar to Dragonlord Kai'Sa, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We have Venerable Piggy Bank in both these because it could be really powerful in general as an augment, but there's one Exalted I want to call in particular for this comp. It's the Exalted that has Aphelios, Nautilus, and Lissandra. That is the nuts for this composition because you just get natural Exalted anyways. So if you see that variant in your game, this is definitely the version of Ashe you should be aiming for. Faded Syndra got buffed this patch. Syndra in general got more butterflies starting, so she ends up being much faster on the scaling aspect of things. So she's a better carry to play around this patch. The 4 Dryad variation has just taken over right now as some of the best versions that you can play around Syndra because it gives the comp what it really wants, is a ton of HP and stall and AP burst. The more you stall, the more butterflies Syndra ramps up, the more damage you'll ultimately do and outscale your opponents. Fade Emblem is best on Azir, but you could also put it on Annie or Ornn as well if you want more frontline. And then another discovery that we figured out is that you actually want to faded pair Syndra and Ahri and not necessarily just Thresh and Set like you did before. This is because that you have so much natural stall anyways through the immense amount of Dryad HP plus the faded stats that you should be able to stall enough for Syndra and already go crazy with the amount of damage. And AP scaling every single butterfly is bananas. Another thing worth noticing, you can also play Dryad vertical as well. So you can play 5 Faded and 6 Dryad instead of going for 7 Faded. And so you can put the Dryad emblem onto units like Annie or even Syndra herself, replaces Death Cap because Dryad's a form of AP, and Syndra becomes really tanky. So it's actually nice. You can actually, you know, open up like a spatula portal and then slam Dryad or Faded emblem, kind of flex between the two, and then go for either 5-7 Faded or 4-6 Dryad and play open. The other thing we discovered about Syndra is that she actually wants 2 mana items directly, like 2 tier items, and not necessarily just like, you know, blue buff and Nashers only. So her item options have actually opened. Before, it felt like if you didn't get blue buff, you couldn't play Syndra because like Shojin was so much worse. And one adapted didn't feel that good. But double adaptive ends up being really powerful in this setup if you have no additional attack speed. So like you don't want like best friends or you have my bow in this setup. Because someone did the calculations and the math says that if you have 2 adaptives on Syndra with no attack speed, she basically gets to squeeze in 1 extra cast, which can be huge because she's trying to scale her butterflies as fast as you can. But if you don't get double adaptive, just go for blue buff and Nashers, and that can be also really effective. The downside of this is that if you do make 2 adaptives, you are pretty much just playing Syndra or Sylas. It's going to be really tricky to play anything else unless you want to fast line and play around the AP board that we're about to talk about. And so you are kind of narrow and you don't have that many outs. So if you miss Syndra, you're just kind of doomed. And that's kind of the risk and reward of playing a composition like this. You do have to hit. And if you're stuck on Syndra 1, it's also noticeably worse. Fast line AP is still really good. It's something you can default to. And honestly, it's just basically like the Fast 9 comp. It's pretty much the same as like the Irelia Hui comp, which we'll talk about a little bit briefly, but it's like the AP variant of it. Basically, right now, late game, if you get to 9 and you don't know what to do, play Dragonlords, play Altruists, play like Wukong and Heavenly, and just have like a couple of really high DPS carries, like Azir in this case. Rakan is really good support. Sandra for utility. And you just outvalue like a ton of boards because they can't kill your front line because you're too tanky, and Azir will eventually just snipe everything. And besides that, it's kind of hard to like play into this from the beginning. You pretty much just play this if you are very much high rolling and you just kind of like don't have anything to roll for on 8th because you're too strong, or you're in a situation where you know you're going to fall off if you stay on 8, so you have to get to 9 and just roll for 5 costs instead of rolling for 4 costs. This is something you can play for, but this is going to be really rare. I would say that unless you're really experienced in Fast 9, you're probably going to play this like once every 10 to 15 games if you're looking for it, like you're slamming Shojin, Death Cap, and trying to flex around like sages and whatnot. So this is an S tier only because it's just one of the highest capped comps in the game, but you're going to be playing it pretty infrequently. Dragonlord Kai'Sa Xayah is also the second variant of the Kai'Sa comp, which is just enough units different from the original that makes us feel like it needs its own entry. This is what is going to be the ultimate late game variation of the 4 Trickshot Kai'Sa comps that you want to play. You're dropping Sivir and Teemo, and you drop, you know, units like Aatrox and Sylas. They just play high quality units like Udyr, Azir, and then the Dragonlords for the AoE stun. This ends up being like what you end up going for once you hit Xayah 2, and you can end up rolling for this a little bit more consistently because they buffed some of the low cost odds at higher levels in exchange for 4 costs. Late game, you don't really need 4 Trickshot for Xayah 2 to do crazy DPS, and that 4 Dragonlord board wide stun ends up being enough time for you to snipe really powerful units. Just pound for pound, the unit quality is just better than the other ones, so this just caps the highest, and so you end up just playing around this board off of like the mega fortune cash outs. One thing to note is if you do want to replace 4 Dragonlord, you often can. If your Inkshadow tattoo is not good as well, you can cap even higher by, you know, replacing Volibear with a Irelia and then replacing Diana and Janna with more frontline. That's the way you can cap even higher if you end up getting a good scenario for that. But again, you're not really playing these comps very often. I mentioned that it's like a 1 in 10, 1 in 15. It might even be rarer than that that you land on these compositions, but I just want people to know in the back of their heads how to play for her first, because sometimes you're just like in this spot where you're playing for Trickshot Kai'Sa, or you're playing, you know, an AP variant of a board like Syndra, and you're just like, I don't get it. How do I cap higher? You know, you're in Scuttle Puddle, you're in Crab Rave, and you're like level 10. Like, surely this is just, I could do a little bit more than just play, you know, 2 costs on my board. Ultimately, having things and knowledge of these 5 cost comps in the late game will help you get those wins. Starting off in the A tier, we have a brand new composition playing around Umbral Alune. Alune was very good in PvE, but she's not actually that reliable for most of the set until this patch. Now, you want to play around Vertical Umbral and use Alune as your anchor while playing around secondary carries, mainly around Sylas, but also depends on if you hit things like an Umbral Emblem. Umbral Emblem is really good on a bunch of other supporting units that can do either high burst or AoE. A lot of times you end up putting it on just a unit like Azir in the late game, but You could always put it on early game units like Teemo if you play Trickshot, because he just spreads out the AoE. On the mid game, you could also put on other invokers. If you hit like a Lillia 2 while rolling down, you could play like Lillia plus Alune for 2 invokers. If you hit Kayn 2, you can put on Morgana and then get like 6 Umbral Morgana because she AoEs. And then if a single tick of her Blizzard does enough damage to get to the execute range, they will kill it. So there's a lot of versatility with this composition that's really good. In fact, I actually would venture that this is actually one of those still the most unexplored lines that people aren't playing enough right now. In fact, I would venture to say that right now Umbral is still one of the most unexplored trees in the game alongside Ghostly. And I think there's probably going to be further optimization. For example, in my opinion, even though we have Yone here, one thing that I personally don't like is playing Yone in the comp, because I just feel like he's a gold sink. Late game, he doesn't do anything. He might wound 1 unit, and that's about it. And so I'd rather play Darius and then put my Umbral emblem onto an Irelia. Irelia does her splines, damages a bunch of units on the board. If any of them are in execute range, she instantly kills them. So that's like one variation of Umbral that I think is really good, but I don't think people are playing around commonly. And so there's a lot more exploration to be done. Despite that, people still think that this comp is really good and caps out very high and can win a lot of games, especially if you get set 2 and Alune 3. As you might notice, we don't actually have Alune at 3-star because in reality, you can actually push a 9 with just a 2-star board. You hit 2-star Alune, 2-star Sylas, 1-star Set, and then, you know, just like 2-star Umbrals. That's enough usually to push a 9. And then once you get to 9, then you could roll for all the 5 costs, Ornn, Azir, and then hit Alune 3 as well in the process. You don't have to hit Alune 3 on 7. Best in slot Alune is generally mana generation, Spear of Shojin, if not, probably Adaptive Helm, and AP. You can give her Morello, but if not Morello, just give her more damage, like Jewel Gauntlet or Giant Slayer, things like that. And Sylas takes just good Sylas items, just a bunch of AP Bruiser stuff. Also worth noting that you can force this comp if you hit things like Wrath of the Moon or Umbral +1. Those are good enough for you to justify, just say, hey, I'm just going to play it. The one thing I will say is that AD items are a little bit awkward in this composition. If you do end up getting like a bunch of gloves, swords, and bows, it can be tricky. If you get a bunch of bows, try to make red buff instead of Morel and Omicron. But I still have yet to figure out what to do with a ton of swords in this comp. I'm going to go ahead and segue this into Midnight Siphon, Yorick's hero augment reroll, to talk about the ways that you do want to reroll around Alune 3. Alune 3 is really good complement to Yorick 3 because Yorick stalls infinitely, and then Alune gets to systematically pick off units one by one and execute them. You're going to be rolling on level 7 for this because the odds of 2 costs actually got improved at 7 last patch, and you do want to maximize your odds of hitting some of the 4 costs like Sylas as well. It doubles your chances. Midnight Siphon is pretty much an always take if you have any defensive commands whatsoever, even if you have no Yoricks. As long as you're able to activate like 2 Umbral, 2 Behemoth early on Yorick 1 with like 1 or 2 items, you might even just streak the entire stage. He's very, very good and reliable to play around. In this variant, for example, I showed you a high cap with the Darius Irelia build that I was talking about. But yeah, you can definitely experiment with around. There's even people who play around like 4 to 6 Behemoth in the mid game because they're just cheap units. You can play Malphite 2, Cho'Gath 2, throw in a Shen, and that end up might being like a way you can tag in Exalted as well. There's a lot of variations with those cheap units that you're able to get Exalted in. So definitely give this composition a try if you want. I believe Yorick Hero Augment is the best out of all the hero augments, but a lot of hero augments are pretty good. We'll actually talk about that in a little bit. Duelist Reroll is back. They buffed Duelist, they buffed Tristana, they buffed Volibear, so how could it be bad? And here's the kicker. You don't actually need a Duelist emblem to make it work. Duelists primarily thrive off of snowballing tempo and a lot of combat augments. When I say a lot of combat augments, I mean probably like 3 of them, like Keepers, Combat Casters, and Extended Duel. 3 combat augments that are like the Exodia if you're able to set it up. Just really insane if you can get that early game snowballing. The other thing we figured out with Duelist is that Lee Sin is also just an equal viable condition to Volibear 3. You can just sometimes play like level 8, roll for Lee Sin 2, stabilize on the board, and then go for Tristana 3 and Volibear 2. That's why we have all these items set up in this way, because practically speaking, you're not going to be able to get 10 full items on your composition. You're just like wondering, you're like, what am I going to do? Am I going to put items on Volibear and then Lee Sin and then Tristana? Basically, we're just showing you multiple variants of how to play Duelist. You can play for a tempo-oriented level 8, 2-star everything, and then if you're really high rolling, you can go to 9. Otherwise, stay on 8 and roll for Tristana 3, Volibear 3 for your win cons. Really easy comp to play. Just play around either the Fated Start or the Heavenly Melee. Anchor around Darius, Yasuo, or Qiyana, and just try your best to make sure that you don't get stuck on tanks. It's really easy for some of your units to get stuck on those AoE tanks and eat a bunch of CC, so Just be mindful of that. There are some things that you can do around heavenly variations of Duelist as well. If you want to hybridize and go for a heavenly Duelist with like a heavenly emblem on Lee Sin, that usually only is possible if you hit like Wukong early and you have a heavenly emblem. So for the most part, you're always going to be playing around 6 Duelists. It's rare that you go lower than that because the damage reduction is really huge. One really good item for this composition is Mittens, which shrinks the holder, grants him attack movement speed. Kind of similar to Tiny but Deadly, but it gives him damage reduction and immunity to chill. Very, very good on Lee Sin in particular. Pretty good on some other melee carries as well. But if you get Mittens, very good in Duelist in particular. All right, Heavenly Kayn did get nerfed because Kayn has reduced magic resistance and armor, which makes him squishier. And it was kind of insane because they buffed his HP. So he was like a tank and a carry. Now he is a little bit more vulnerable, but the way you can navigate around that is you get a Heavenly Emblem. It just goes directly on Kayn now as opposed to putting it on Morgana, because now whoever's holding it gets double the Omnivamp. And that's really powerful. It's like having 2 Heavenly Emblems on your team previously. But you pretty much play it the same way you did in the previous patch. Have like a Darius opener, start off with things like Hand of Justice and some bruiser items. Lee Sin is also a really good dual carry as well. I think people really just sleep on this unit in general. On the podcast I recorded with Disso, we were talking about how Lee Sin is really underrated. I think that he's a really good dual carry in particular if you can get him and Kayn going. And even in late game situations, you might end up dropping Kayn, holding onto Lee Sin, and playing around higher value units in general. Positioning does matter a lot with Lee Sin and Kayn. Taking down the same target is really crucial. So just make sure that they're generally on the same target so they can burst through and get to the back line. The new artifact that I would probably think around playing for Kayn would be Spectral Cutlass. This is the item that says at the combat start, teleport the holder to the mirror hex on the enemy side of the board, and then it TPs them back to the original location. That does allow Kayn to get some really crazy assassinations because he just can burst very fast. And I do think that this item is better than the stats indicate because I do think it's very skill intensive with how you position and hedge. But there's also other ones that you can play around. You can just do Infinity Force or Death Defiance. Those are all still really good on Kayn. If you want a video showing how crazy Spectral Cutlass can be, check out my Reroll Qiyana variant that I got to assassinate backline at the start of every fight, and it was just snowballing out of control. It was pretty crazy. Okay, Sage Sylas, aka Sabio Flex, as the Brazilians call it. I put a whole guide on Sylas and how it's the best forecast that you're not playing. It turns out everyone knows how to play Sylas now, or rather everyone tries to play Sylas. They're really hard comp to play and really easy to mess up because if you misposition Sylas or you're weak on stage 4, you can get punished really badly because Sylas is a melee unit, and if he's your entire damage source, a 1-star Sylas gets blown up, you have no more DPS, you could be in really big trouble. And so what we figured out with Sylas is that you really have to play the early mid game very well. You need to play around like your Teemo 2, your Zyra 2, your Zoe 2, your Alune 2, figure out different item holders like Annie instead of Sylas, and be very, very flexible with it. It's actually kind of a misnomer to call it Sage Sylas because in reality, Sage is just one element of it. You might end up just playing no Sages and then around Sylas, or maybe you go the opposite direction, you play like 4 Sages but no Sylas. So it's a very hard composition to the point where I'm pretty sure it's actually peak potential at A tier, but in reality it's B tier because I think it's so easy to mess up. A lot of times you end up slamming things like Spark and Adaptive and Crown Guard really early on, and then you're angling Sylas a lot. A lot of times you end up slamming things like Crown Guard and Adaptive early and then getting Spark eventually, splitting up those items onto backline and frontline units, and then combining it on Sylas on your stage 4 roll down. You might notice that we don't have Morgana here, even though we call it Sage Flex. Where's a Morgana? We found out that Hui 1 is better than Morgana in a lot of cases because he kind of does the same thing as Morgana, but he gives you more utility because he heals your team. And the breakpoint between 3 and 4 Sage is not that big of a deal. 5 Sage is a big deal though. So if you can get that, that might be a time where you replace, Hui with Morgana. But Hui ends up being really, really powerful in these kinds of spots. Definitely give him the more guys with Shojin, Morello, or the equivalent of. One thing that has come up in debate is whether or not you position Sylas in the back 2 rows for the additional AP. As you guys know, Sage in the front 2 rows gives you Omnivamp, and the back 2 rows gives you additional ability power. And so that's given some people belief that Sylas situationally should be positioned towards the back. A lot of good players say that that is bad. Dissoap, for example, the person that I'm partnering with for TFT Academy and Permarank 1, thinks that it's pretty much a mistake to ever do it. While other people like Robin Songs have gone on public record to say that you actually can think about it really often, if not play it as a default. And so I would say experiment, try it for yourself. Most of the time, I personally am putting Sylas in the front 2 rows. And if I'm losing a lot of matchups, let's say you're in a 1v1 situation, you're both at 40 HP, You know you have 3 fights to settle it out. Maybe try Sylas in the back row if your front row Sylas is not working out. Those are situations you can experiment with it because sometimes that extra AP helps you get past the front line if you don't need that Omnivamp. But then there's some awkward things like if you slam Crown Guard on Sylas, put him in the back line, the shield kind of expires after 8 seconds. What's the purpose of Crown Guard there? Maybe you just need Crown Guard on somebody else. It could actually matter based on your itemizations, your augments, and your setup. But this is one of my favorite comps to play. If you want more information, check out the Sage Sylas guide that I put on my YouTube. One thing I want to call out is Suspicious Trenchcoat is like obscenely good on Sylas. And there's a couple of theories as to why. The first is that Suspicious Trenchcoat keeps the buffs of the traits on top. So if you're playing things like Bruisers and Sages and whatnot, all 3 of those individual copies get the bonus HP and stats. So it almost feels like those 3 Sylases are just as strong as the first Sylas. And this is also really pronounced if you get Umbral in because they all can execute and it can be really, really difficult to deal with. So if you get Suspicious Trenchcoat, definitely play it on Sylas. It's one of the best items on him. Also, I think this is just like one of the best artifacts in general because there's so many crazy combos that you can put with this. For example, Trenchcoat's really good with like Diamond Hands. I saw a clip of Soju where he had Diamond Hands on Sylas and he ended up getting 4 gold per turn because it just kept splitting and getting 3 copies of Diamond Hands on top of the original one. And so there's way too many combos for this to be abused. I'd highly recommend taking things like Capricious Forge as well. That's a really good augment that can give you crazy combos and show you some of the potential of these artifacts. Shen Hero Augment Reroll is really fun still. You go double Rage Blade, you get Time Knife, Shen just attacks a bunch, get the true damage in, scale really deep into the fight, and just, 1v9 everything. Very, very cool composition. Best in slot, double Rage Blade and Giant Slayer. You do want to go for Yorick 3, but sometimes you can't, especially if there's another Umbral player in the lobby. One thing I will say is that I don't think enough Shen players build Quicksilver, especially if there are ways to stall Shen like an Eternal Winter or a bunch of CC. You would replace the Giant Slayer here. You go Rage Blade, and Quicksilver, and then you'll try to use augments to compensate for bonus damage like Know Your Enemy or other things like that. You're going to be rolling on 6 for this composition because Shen 3 is what matters the most. Yes, you do want to get 6 Behemoth as soon as possible, but you do ultimately want to get Shen 3. This is in contrast to like Yorick's Umbral variant because you want to roll for a 2 and a 3 cost. And those odds are pretty good split at level 7. But you pretty much just pick up like the random one-off Ornn as you're rolling and maybe his 6 Behemoth. Ghostly is important as well. Don't ignore that on Shen. Dryad Gnar got nerfed. 6 Dryad got weaker because Riot took it down a peg or 2. But it doesn't mean that this composition isn't possible to win out. If you get really good combat augments like Mulched, +1 Dryad, Baboom, still really good setup for Gnar. Gnar generally wants double healing, so Bloodthirster and Hand of Justice is often what you build because you just hard to get 2 Bloodthirsters, for example. Bloodthirster in general, I think, is superior to Hand of Justice because Bloodthirster scales off of your HP. You get an HP shield. Dryad gives you more HP. Bloodthirster is a better defensive unit. The really hard thing about this composition is that, 1, you really want to hit Gnar 3 and Kindred 3 and get 3 items on both, so it's a little bit of an item economy issue. 2, you really need like a good amount of combat augments. And then 3, there's a bunch of people who are playing like Fated lines now and taking your Kindreds and Gnar, and they're like directly contesting you. And as you guys might have experienced, even 1 person contesting or 2 people playing the Fated line can just take out so many Gnars and Kindreds. It feels like you're just stuck on 2-star and you can't hit. That being said, if you're able to get to the late game and get to Azir, you end up winning and you have critical mass because you have too much HP and opponents can't stop you. So the composition is good, high ceiling. It is weaker and less consistent than before because you're being contested. And so it's actually not entirely uncommon for you to go like 7th or 8th with this composition or like top 2. Positioning does really matter. Make sure you have, Gnar on the same side as the enemy carries because once he kills the unit in front of him, he walks to the back line, tries to snipe the back line. If he's on the opposite side, he might give them time to stall, especially if it's like a sniper like Ashe. Also, Gnar can get really stuck on some hyper tanks like Annie with Porcelain, so just be mindful of that. This is a composition you can justify rolling on 7, by the way, because yes, you do want Gnar and Kindred 3, but you do want to activate the ghostly aspect of things. Ghostly Emblem is actually low-key very, very good in this composition. Ghostly Emblem can go on like Kindred, for example, and then have Kindred be like a 4th/6 Ghostly. A little bit underexplored right now currently. I do think Ghostly Emblem is very good, and not enough people are playing it right now. Fine Vintage is still really good, but it's just one of those like very obscure compositions that you play only if you have like a lot of items early in the game, like a component anvil start or like a complete item. Or you're just really confident that your spot is really good because you have a strong early game and you're not going to bleed too much HP for transforming items into support items. Interestingly enough, I think this augment got nerfed again because I think the new support items generally are not very good. If you look at all the new support items, pretty much the one that you care about is Moonstone Renewer. This one's really good and gives you shields to your lowest HP units. Kind of boring, but it's pretty effective. Giving you like random locket shields throughout the fight can be really effective. But if you look at the other 4 support items that got introduced, Eternal Flame, Knight's Vow, Unstable Treasure, and Spite, these are all some of the worst performing support items. There's actually a belief that Spite just literally doesn't work. It's supposed to give you like a reduction of AD and AP onto the enemy, but allegedly it doesn't actually work some of the times. So yeah, this augment actually got worse because you get offered terrible support items from time to time. So yeah, take at your own discretion. Still very high cap. It's kind of like a 50% top 4 rate, but like a 20% win rate. So if you get to top 4, oftentimes you can win. One of the craziest high cap ceiling silvers, but very tricky to play. And really, Fast 9, Fast 10 is basically the AD variant that you're leaning towards for Fast 9. You know, we talked about how you can play around like Azir AP for your setups for Fast 9. You can also play around Irelia and AD. The reason why this is A tier is because it does win many things, but just look at how many 5 costs you want to play. It's kind of like, if it's 5 cost, click it and play it type of composition. And so we feel like it's worth like including in case you need a reference sheet of how to play around it. The cheaper variation to play around this is just 4 Dragonlord, Irelia, plus an AP unit like Hui and Azir. Also, I do want to shout out that this variant of Irelia, Hui, and Soraka for Exalted is buff freaking nanas. If you're able to get this 3 Exalted in, then you just pretty much can win the game. So a lot of times, if you're in that Exalted portal, you're looking to play like this comp. But playing this comp is hard, right? It's like, how do you get to level 10 basically and play it? The answer is you're just snowballing with a crazy amount of economy. You're playing like Slam In, you're playing Level Up, you got Epoch, other things that help you just like stabilize your board and push levels. That's usually how you get to this board. So it's not that consistent, but it is one way that you can play for the win and close out a lot of those high econ portals. Okay, B and C tier, we're going to do very fast commentary because we're going to be here all day if we go into depth. But for the new comps, I do want to spend some time on it. The first thing we're going to start off with is Ghostly Syndra. This is a new variation of Ghostly post-patch because Ghostly got changed to be a little bit more intrinsically selfish, meaning that only the Ghostly units are benefited from it. So if you get a Ghostly emblem, it could be really, really good. And also Syndra got buffed, and she ends up being a really nice slot if you're able to get Syndra plus things like Kindred for the Reaper on Kayn, and then Set for the Warden with Alawi. This is also a really nice way to play Syndra if you haven't collected any faded units. If you're in a situation where you're rolling, you were slamming items, and you're like, man, I'm looking for Sylas, and then you rolled, and you're like, man, I'm just picking up Syndra instead, and then you're like, but I have no faded units, how am I supposed to play 5-7 faded? You can get into the Ghostly variant and try to play around Syndra, because pretty much the only low-cost unit you need is Caitlyn, and everything else you're eventually going to pick up because of the odds. It is on the newer side. The stats with Ghostly Emblem on Syndra are really good. In fact, if you look at it, 3.8, 63% top 4 rate. Very, very good. But as you can see, like just by filtering it, there's only like 60 games of it. So kind of hard to say definitively. So if you want some cutting edge tech, we give it to you. Try out Syndra in particular with Ghostly. But if you bought forward with it, don't blame us, blame Warthog. Riven Reroll is the other composition that has surfaced due to the massive buffs to Riven. The biggest problem with this composition, the reason why it's second B tier, is I think there's too many people that want to pick up Riven in their compositions. If they are playing 4 Trickshot Bruisers, if they're playing a Storyweaver opener, or heck, maybe they're just playing like, Altruist and they're throwing in the extra Riven in their reroll compositions like Janna, Zyra, or Bard. You just lose a bunch of Rivens, and hitting it on time is so difficult. If you do manage to get Riven 3 with setups like, Titans BT, blue buff, whatever you want, you can go for second Titans. It can be very good. I've also played a setup where you play 8 Bruiser with Riven. That has potential as well. But it's just so hard to actually hit. I'm pretty sure you actually want to play around Riven with well-fed and Bruisers the most, but I think a lot of people have been trying this variant in particular. So it's new. It also should get the tag experimental. Not entirely sure. But if you want to play an off-meta reroll at 2 costs and you see not a lot of people angling for things, give this reroll Riven a try. Senna Storyweaver got buffed. In fact, I probably should have said this early in the video. Part of the reason why Storyweaver is back to being a good opener is because they buffed Chaos on hit damage. For the talismans, you can play either Talisman of Aid or Talisman of Might, aka you could play green or blue Kale. It's just up to you, really, depending on your spot. Sometimes that extra shred can be really nice early, but triple blue is like max amount of DPS for your burst. If you have like an early Shiv or Spark, you definitely don't need the Talisman of Aid. So make sure you end up prioritizing that. Usually the times that you play this, if you get a Storyweaver +1, which has gotten buffed because the crest now gives you a Storyweaver unit, that was not the case a patch or 2 ago. Second Storyweaver is really good on one specific Exalted. It is the one that has both Garen and Irelia as the Exalted. So you can look here and see Garen, Lux, Aphelios, or Irelia. In this case, I just play Garen, Irelia, and then Ornn. And then you had the Exalted bonus on the KO, and she does some crazy DPS. Janna's Zyra Reroll is still really good. I personally believe that you don't really want to play without Enter the Dragon. In my opinion, still pretty much a hero augment for her. But I've seen some people play like Trade Sector into Janna and then just get some good tempo off of it. The reason why this is so good is because it dominates early mid game, like stage 2 and stage 3. If you get like early Zyra 2, early Janna 2 with items, you can pretty much bully everybody. And then you also basically stat check a bunch of people in stage 4. So anyone who's not hitting their 2-star 4 cost, you will completely destroy in stage 4. And so you preserve so much HP, you just kind of naturally bleed into like an easy third a lot of times if you hit. There is an Exalted that gives you both Zyra and Janna, and all you have to do is tag in a Sylas, which is great. So you can play that variation of Exalted if you want, and replace something like Neeko, because you just have a frontliner and that complements Riven. Bard is back, but not necessarily just because of the stat buffs he got. It's also because he's really good and conditional with 2 specific artifacts in particular. The first support item you want to think about is Wit's End, which says attacks deal bonus magic damage and heals the holder for 35% of all magic damage and gives you attack speed. This is pretty much like the Bard item because it gives Bard the attack speed, which is what he scales off of, and it gives him on-hit bonus damage. And so it just scales his stats way better. In fact, look at the delta on this. This is bananas. This means that on average, when you're playing Wit's End on Bard, you gain over a placement. So if it's like, you know, expected to be a top 4 comp, you actually a top 3 comp or better. So it's really, really strong. The other really good artifact is Forbidden Idol, which says that shields convert their value into max HP. And that's really good on Tahm Kench because Tahm Kench is casting pretty often since he's taking so much damage, and he'll turn into like a giant HP sponge that people can't get past. And then Bard is going to heal it. And then you scale both of them accordingly. So those are the conditions of which I would play Bard to get either Forbidden Idol or you get Wit's End. Neeko's hero augment is getting a lot of praise. This is actually one of the biggest deviations of opinion between myself and Dirsoap. Neeko's being played a lot more in SEA and China over in like the East, but in the West, pretty much nobody plays Neeko hero augment, which is Drop Blossom. And I think that that might be a mistake on the West parts because they probably just are very biased against Neeko. There's 2 reasons why I think this augment's a lot better. One is Lissandra's nerf. People are playing Lissandra less often, and Lissandra was the big time predator of things like Neeko, was like your tank and your carry, and she would just, you know, pot it, throw it to the back line, and Neeko would struggle immensely. And the second is that people are playing Heavenly less often, and so you're able to hit Neeko more and therefore 3-star her. One thing to note is that we updated her build to now include Gargoyle Stoneplate instead of a Titans. Titans nerfed the AP. Neeko wants that AP instead to give her that tankiness. The 2 variants you can play around are 7 Mythic, and there's another variant you can play around, which is Vertical Heavenly, but you definitely need the Heavenly emblem to make that happen. And in my opinion, it's less consistent, but has a higher ceiling. Kog'Maw Reroll also got buffed. I think Kog'Maw is pretty item dependent, but also augment dependent. You really want too much candy. I'm pretty sure this augment is what really ends up enabling Kog'Maw, because how fast you hit Kog'Maw 3 and Cho'Gath 3 almost determines your placements. If you hit it at the beginning of stage 3, you're top 3, maybe even playing for higher, depending on if you're able to get the correct items. If you hit it in the middle stage 3, you're probably top 4. If you hit it by the beginning of stage 4, you're bot 4. If you get it in the middle stage 4, you're 8th. So it's pretty much just like when you hit the 1 cost. And I wouldn't really play this unless you get like a lot of Kog'Maws early. And I mean like a lot, like 5 by the beginning of stage 2. But he did get buffed. And I do want to say that there is belief that maybe you're supposed to play Kog'Maw Reroll with the new Neeko hero augment. Like if you hit Drop Blossom, maybe that means you're supposed to reroll Kog'Maw with Neeko. But that kind of means that you need like 6 specific items. So it's kind of like you need to hit both and have Pandora's. Kind of situational, hence why it's B tier, but I have seen it do well in the games that I've watched. Before I was word, Dirsoap is a big time doubter. He said he hasn't seen any of his games. So I've watched some challenger games of Vietnam and SEA and China. Dirsoap said he doesn't see any of his games. Take that for what you will. 7 Inkshadow is still viable, but you kind of need a snowball high roll, usually anchored off of playing a Inkshadow crest that gives you Senna 2 and you're able to have tempo early. The issue is that you're pretty much just rolling for very specific units, and in this current meta you need to be more versatile than just rolling for 1 unit, or the comp has to be so powerful, so obscenely good that rolling for like the 1-star variation of it is good enough to stabilize, and it's just not. If you miss Kai'Sa at all and you're playing 5 Inkshadow in stage 4 and 5 and you miss, you're gonna take big time DPS. So in general, the lack of versatility of having to hit 7 Inkshadow on stage 4 and the fact that you're gated by Udyr can be really tricky. Oh, and also your tattoos are situational, and they nerfed one really important aspect of it, which is things like Tattoo of Vitality used to scale off of Irelia and her auto attacks. And so now that you lose really powerful 5-cost interaction like that, the Tados 2s lose a little bit of value. Zoe Reroll is actually really interesting right now because she's in a better spot, but people are still not playing around her. I do think that she has some more exploration to do. For one thing, I don't even know if this is the best variant to play around Zoe. This is just like one of the established ways we figured out to do, which is have her be 3-star with everything, right? 3-star Zoe, 3-star Diana, maybe even just 3-star Janna and Zyra alongside Soraka. So this is like the old variant to play around Zoe, but Arcanists got buffed, so it's entirely possible that we're about to pull up the Arcanist variation. Maybe you play 3-star Zoe in 6 Arcanists and have a different front line. I think that game they won, they had +1 Arcanists, and they were even able to get things like 8 Arcanists quickly, and that can be like a really good way to cap out your board. But Zoe Reroll is a thing. I just don't know how and when to play it that consistently because I haven't tried it in many of my games. Kobuko Hero Augment is really good. You can reroll him to try and get like 3-star stats on Kobuko. You can also reroll Riven, by the way. This is another way you can play Riven Reroll. Kind of piggybacking off of what we said earlier in the tier list. And the backline is just like versatile of whatever you want to play. Before it was like Lissandra because Lissandra was really, really good, but you can play Sages, you can play Trickshot, you can play 5 costs. Just pretty much get 6-8 bruisers and then watch Kobuko be a big fat idiot and just do the Macarena and dab on everybody. Sylas is going to be secondary carry, and yeah, pretty much just hit Kobuko as fast as you can, or if not, push levels. You don't actually have to roll for Kobuko 3, and you can instead just use it to push for level 8 as fast as you can, and then get to 9 for 5 costs. Arcanists did get buffed. We're keeping them in B tier. It's just that I think Arcanists are really hard because this is the 4th variant now we're showing you to play around Syndra, and that could be really tough. Amumu 3 and Alawith are also hard to hit in a lot of lobbies, especially if you have multiple people playing for Ashe / Porcelain lines. You're pretty much not going to hit that. And so it's kind of just the victim of having the units be taken from all different kinds of angles, and the power level isn't high enough to justify it. That being said, you hit Arcanist Crown. I believe they re-enabled Mind Over Matter. That is possible for you to get to 6 Arcanists and be very stable in the mid game. Also, as we mentioned before, it's entirely possible you're not supposed to play around the Faded line like Syndra, Ahri, and Set. Instead, you play around Zoe and try to get her involved and kind of fuse maybe these 2 comps together. Okay, and very quickly through C tier, Build Different got nerfed pretty considerably, and so now you're in a situation where you're unlikely to streak early, and it's really important to hit 4 cost. The odds of hitting 4 costs are reduced. It's just a bad time. You don't really want to play Build-In very often unless you have a really, really strong opener and maybe get like a gold portal, like gold subscriptions for you to consistently hit. Lillia is just getting worse and worse, and she ends up kind of being the victim of the Arcanists we talked about before. Ashe players are going to be taking Lillia, so you don't really get her very often. She doesn't have a secondary reliable damage source in these kinds of setups. And so flexing around Lillia can be really, really tricky. I will say that I think Mythic Lillia probably has potential, but that's really high roll. And a lot of times you're playing Mythic Lillia anyways with like Kog'Maw Reroll. That's when you could probably play around Lillia as a reliable damage dealer. But Lillia Flex is pretty much just what happens if you don't hit Ashe. So good luck with that. It's just C tier for a reason. And you're just going to be unlikely to top 4, but you can. Shenna, in my opinion, is still kind of on the weaker side. It's possible that we're underrating this composition because, maybe it's actually better post the Ghostly changes. But the Ghostly just makes it so that Senna's not supported anymore nearly as much. And instead, it's about the Ghostly units. So why would you re-roll around Senna 3 and then make it about the Ghostly units like Kayn and Morgana? Doesn't make much sense. It's entirely possible there's just a variation of this comp that we aren't really thinking about. Maybe, it's not this tattoo anymore because tattoos of protection got nerfed. Maybe we're supposed to put Ghostly Emblem onto Senna. Who knows? Either way, right now, most people who try to go for this line are not succeeding. So try to avoid. Heavenly Yone is basically like when you play it is if you collect this absurd amount of Yones, maybe you get like the encounter that gives you a 2-star Yone and you just have like a Yone 2 already. So you just might as well go for Yone 3. Or you have things like Divine Rolls. Or you're like 4-way contested for Heavenly, Lee Sin, Kayn. So you just go for Yone as a different condition. Otherwise, stay away. Garen, Hero Augment is definitely the weakest currently on paper. I do think Storyweaver got better, so this technically got buffed. But I personally believe that Garen is underexplored. I think that the 6 Warden variation of Garen, where you play 6 Wardens, 3 Storyweavers, and some backline support for it, is a lot better than people think about. So give that a try if this version isn't working out. Teemo Reroll is still terrible. The only time I've ever seen Teemo 3 do well is if people are rolling on 8 forever for Kai'Sa. They're rolling for the 4 Trickshot Kai'Sa variant. And then in the process of staying on 8 rolling forever for Kai'Sa 2, they just pick up Teemo 3. That's when I've seen Teemo do well as a 3-star unit. Never really as a primary with things like the 2 healthy boards. If you want to go for it because you love Teemo or you have a good Exalted, right? All the 2 cost ones, you can try it. I would not advise it. Heavenly Darius is actually not even really about Darius anymore because he got nerfed. In fact, we should probably kick this off the tier list. It might not even be on the tier list by the time you watch this video. In fact, I probably should re-enable Kha'Zix instead because Heavenly changed so that the carry of the composition is better with the Heavenly stats. So because Heavenly is more selfish, Kha'Zix is better, Qiyana is better, Soraka is better. So maybe we should probably re-enable Kha'Zix instead of Darius. Darius also got nerfed. Maybe if you get Heavenly Emblem on Darius, he can do some work instead. Like maybe JG Heavenly Emblem +1. But I'm not optimistic. Stay away. And then last but not least, this is like the 6 Ghostly Flex variants. We put it as C tier because I just think we don't understand it. In fact, we have the Ghostly Emblem onto a Mumu. That's probably not right. In general, it's just not solved. So yeah, this is another one that we should probably actually take off our tier list until we figure it out. In fact, this is actually kind of redundant to the 6 Ghostly Syndra variants. As you can tell, it's just like a 6 Ghostly Shell plus Syndra and Faded. And then here is like 6 Ghostly Ashe, but you play like Porcelain instead. Basically, 6 Ghostly is underexplored, undersolved. It's in C tier because I think since we don't know the best variations, we can't recommend it. But if you want to try it out, go for it. So there is my best way to approach 14.9b. There's a lot to digest and there's still a lot to explore. And I haven't even covered like all the different ways we can use artifacts. I only dropped in some knowledge bombs that we already knew. Make sure you check out things at tftacademy.com for the tier list and the podcast so you guys can stay up to date on the meta. That's it for me. Thanks for watching it. I'll see you guys next time.